The unity of being is a philosophy that has been rather controversial in certain circles and in certain times. Some Muslim scholars in history have viewed it as dangerous or sometimes even heretical, but this should not confuse us into believing that it is some fringe philosophy. The unity of being as a doctrine has been incredibly important and influential in the wider world of Sufism and Islam in general, and has even sometimes dominated the intellectual environment of certain regions in Muslim lands. And Sufism itself is of course very internally diverse, with many competing schools of thought and orders and ideas and philosophies, one of these being of course the unity of being, or Wahdat al-Wujud. The unity of being in short terms can be described, to use very simplifying terms, as a monistic or even non-dual philosophy or school of thought within Sufism. It states that there is only one reality, which is God, and that all creation are or is his manifestation. This philosophy is often strongly connected to the medieval Sufi thinker and mystic Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, whom I've made a very long video about that you can find on my channel. But this isn't to say that Ibn Arabi was the first to express these ideas or similar ideas in Sufism. A very famous early example is the Baghdad Sufi Mansur al-Hallaj, who is said to have entered a spiritual ecstasy and proclaimed Ana al-Haq, or I am the truth, or I am the reality, basically saying I am God. Similarly, Bayazid Bistami, who also lived in the 9th century, once proclaimed, "Glory be to me," both signifying a kind of annihilation of the individual self into the absolute reality that is God. But the school of Ibn Arabi is the school that is most strongly associated with this idea, and it is this school that I will be basing this presentation on. So what is Wahdat al-Wujud, or the unity of being? In short terms, the doctrine of the unity of being is based on taking monotheism to its most extreme end. It not only states that God is the only divinity in existence, he is the only being in existence. One of God's so-called 99 names in the Quran is Al-Haq, which means the truth or the real or the reality. With this in mind, the Islamic proclamation, La ilaha illallah, isn't simply read as there is no God but God, or there is no divinity but the divinity, but instead as there is no reality but the real, or thus ultimately there is nothing but God. To Ibn Arabi and his followers, there is only one singular reality, and that reality is God. Ibn Arabi identifies God in his utmost essence as wujud, or being or existence. So God is being, he isn't a being, he is being itself. And since Islamic theology requires that God not only be the only divinity, but also that he is absolutely one, that must necessarily mean that being or existence itself is one, absolutely one. This also means that if anyone says that anything exists except of God, one is actually committing shirk or polytheism, which is the greatest sin in Islam, since you are saying that there is a being that isn't God. But being is God, and that basically means you're saying that there is another God. But if God is the only reality, what are we? What is creation? There appears to be multiplicity everywhere. What's that? To Ibn Arabi, anything other than God, which is creation basically, is utterly non-existent. It's a kind of illusion. He writes, quote, "The world is illusory, it has no real existence. This is what is meant by imagination, khayal. You have been made to imagine that the world is something separate and independently real outside of the absolute. But in reality, this is not so." But it isn't an illusion in the ultimate sense. We do have a certain existence on the physical plane. It's not all a dream, like in Advaita Vedanta in Hinduism, for example. The illusion is the idea of separation, that I exist as a separate being, when in reality only God exists. The only true self is God's self, and ours are only relative reflections of this self. One of the more celebrated scholars from Ibn Arabi's schools, Mahmud Shabistari, wrote a masterpiece of Persian poetry called the Gulshan-i-Raz, in which he explicates the doctrine of the unity of being. And he writes, quote, "When absolute existence is alluded to, people use the word I as a matter of expression. When reality has taken form through individuation, you refer to it in language with the word I. You and I are accidents of the essence of being. like openings in the covering of the lamp of being. Ibn Arabi himself loves to use metaphors to describe this relationship between God and the world. One of them is where he describes it almost like a light, a pure white light, which is God's being, that travels through a prism and creates a multitude of colors, which would be the world. The colors themselves are never the same as the white light, just as the creatures or creation is never the same as God, but at the same time they consist of nothing but the white light. Fakhruddin Iraqi, another famous writer in the Ibn Arabi school, writes the following in his book Lama'at, quote, "Come then into my eyes and look, and you will see a sun shining through 1,000 bits of glass, beaming to plain sight through each array of color. Why should any difference appear between this one and that? All light is one, but colors 1,000-fold." If you've read Hindu philosophy or Taoism or Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart, a lot of this will seem very familiar to you. In fact, the doctrine of the unity of being sometimes bears a striking resemblance to philosophies like Advaita Vedanta or certain ideas within Taoism, for example, among many other things. There are differences, of course, but they share aspects explained thus far, with a single absolute non-dual reality being identified with God and denying the reality of anything beside him. But what creates the forms of the world themselves? What is the world when it is not pure being? And where does multiplicity come from? It will help a bit to try to look at things like the people back then would have viewed the world. Partly thanks to Ibn Sina or Avicenna, philosophically one had at this time started to separate between existence or being, wujud, on the one hand, and essence or whatness, mahia, on the other. When talking about a thing or an object in the world, like this table in front of me, we can ask two basic questions about it. We can ask, is it? And we can ask, what is it? The first question, is it, is a question of existence or being. And the answer to that question would be yes or no. The second question, what is it, gives a completely different answer. And this is the question of essence or whatness, in this case, a table. Table is independent of whether or not it exists. It is an essence or a whatness that can either exist or not exist. It can either have existence or wujud, being, or it can not have existence or being. So according to Wahdat al-Wujud, in terms of the existence or the being, the wujud of the objects of the world, they are God. Because remember, God is being. He is being itself. He's the only being. And so God is thus our being. He is our being. However, in terms of our essences, our whatness, we are absolutely not God. We are that which, by definition, God isn't. I, as a human being, Philip Holm, cannot possibly be God, because I am everything that God isn't. I am finite, I am temporal, I am mortal, I have a certain form. These are all things that God cannot possibly be. So this is the relationship that we have here. We are simultaneously God and not God. We are absolute existence and we are absolute non-existence. We are being and non-being all at the same time. But it doesn't end here. These essences or whatnesses also has a relationship with God, even if they aren't God directly. Here we will need to have some basic knowledge of Islamic theology again. So according to mainstream Islamic theology, God is absolutely transcendent beyond any creaturely qualities. So he doesn't have any attributes or qualities that any created things or creatures have. But according to the Quran and mainstream Islamic theology, he still has certain attributes. And each of his names, like Al-Haq or Ar-Rahman or Ar-Rahim and so on, all of these names that he's referred to by, corresponds to a certain attribute that he has. So Al-Haq means the truth or the real. He is the real. He is the truth. Ar-Rahman means the merciful. He is merciful. Ar-Rab means the Lord, for example. So all these names that he has is also an attribute that he has. Now traditionally in the Quran it is said that God has 99 names and thus also 99 attributes. But according to Ibn Arabi, the names are actually infinite. He has an infinite amount of names and an infinite amount of attributes and qualities. And these attributes and qualities have a very important role to play in creation. There's a hadith Qudsi, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad where God is speaking through him, in which God says, "I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known, so I created the world so that I might be known." Ibn Arabi loves this hadith as he uses it frequently. It is the key to understanding creation and the purpose behind it. I was a hidden treasure refers to God's essence and the attributes that are hidden therein. I loved to be known. He wants this hidden treasure to be experienced. Now, of course, he knows his own attributes since he is he. But he still wants his essence and attributes to be experienced through someone who is not him. So I created the world so that I might be known. Therefore, the world is created as a way for God to experience himself through someone other than himself. But since this hidden treasure is to be known through the world, that must mean that the world contains traces of these attributes and qualities of God, right? This is absolutely true. To Ibn Arabi, the world is nothing but, to use William Chittick's words, the loci of God's self-disclosure, or God's self-manifestation. So everything in the world, every essence in philosophical terms, every particle of this world reflect and reveal God's qualities and attributes in an indirect sense, like in a mirror. This is based partly on a Quranic verse that Ibn Arabi loves to apply, which goes, "Whichever way you turn, there is the face of God." Now remember, the things of the world, or creation itself, is not God. He is absolutely transcendent of them. But in a real sense, they reflect everything in the world. The entire cosmos reflects God's attributes, and thus they are God in a sense too. In any case, since God is infinite, and so are the possibilities of his attributes, there is no end to the constant self-manifestation of God in the world. At every moment, at every instant, the world is created anew, revealing a new self-disclosure. The world in that sense becomes the continuous unfolding of God's manifestation in limited form. It's the unfolding of possibilities inherent in actuality. The essences of the world, the things, are contained in God's knowledge beyond time and space as something he calls the ayan athabita, the immutable entities. These are non-existent in themselves, but function almost as archetypes that determine what is created in the actual cosmos. And these ayana thabita are themselves determined by God's attributes as they in their totality reflect him. So God has these attributes or qualities, and then he has a knowledge of his own attributes or qualities, which are infinite, so there's an infinite number of possibilities, an infinite number of ways that his attributes can be manifested, and all these ways, all these forms in which he can manifest himself are contained in his own knowledge beyond time, and after which, when he wants to create something, he simply gives those archetypes, those ayana thabita, he gives them being. And at each instant is a new creation. At each instant is a new reflection of God that's constantly unfolding before our eyes. I know this is a whole lot to take in, and you may have to watch this a few times if this is all new to you, but believe it or not, that is actually the basic, very basic, simple explanation of the doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud. It is, you could say, a non-dual philosophy where reality is ultimately oneness and nothing exists except for God. He is all of being, and he is the one in whose being my being resides. But there are many other nuances to it that make it a lot more complicated, as I hope I have shown you. Some scholars, Western scholars, especially in the past, have referred to Ibn Arabi as a pantheist or a panentheist. And of course, while this is understandable, it really isn't that accurate, at least from the traditional perspective, the traditional understanding of the word pantheism. Ibn Arabi does, in a way, affirm that the world is God, since there is nothing but God, but at the same time, he's very careful to point out that the world is at the same time absolutely not God, and that God completely transcends the world. In fact, the world is, as I've said, the very definition of what God isn't. In terms of itself, the world is absolute nothingness, non-being who has, quote, never smelt a whiff of existence. This point is finely expressed by the 19th century figure Emir Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi, famous for his defense against French colonialism, who was also a follower of Ibn Arabi and his school. He states, quote, I am two things, according to two different relations. With respect to you, I am the eternal, forever and ever. I am the necessary being who epiphanizes himself. With respect to me, I am pure non-being, who has never breathed the perfume of existence, the adventitious being who remains non-existent in his adventitiousness. So as I mentioned earlier, the entire cosmos is a manifestation, a reflection of the entirety of God's names, or the entirety of God's attributes. While a certain object in the world or a certain thing only reflects one or a certain combination of certain attributes or names, the entire cosmos reflects all of the names. So the creation as a whole is a direct reflection of God's entire nature, all of his attributes. The cosmos is thus often referred to by Ibn Arabi as the macrocosm, or the great man, Insan al-Kabir. But the human being also has a central role to play in this scheme, and he is often referred to as the microcosm, or the small man, Insan al-Saghir. The human being thus also reflects all the names and all the attributes, but in a contained form. So the human being is a microcosmic reflection of the macrocosm that is the entire universe. And so everything that exists on the inside exists on the outside, as above, so below, and so on. Man, in his most perfect and primordial form, is known as Insan al-Kamil, or the perfect or universal man. Insan al-Kamil is a designation of God's perfect manifestation in human form, a human being who has reached a state of complete self-annihilation, where he recognizes himself as nothing but God's reflection and acts accordingly. In the perfect man, God is finally able to witness and glorify himself like in a mirror. One of the more famous writers and poets from the school of Ibn Arabi is a man by the name of Fakhruddin Iraqi, who wrote an incredible piece of it was a combination of prose and poetry called Lama'at, which means divine flashes. And in this book, he presents this relationship between God and the world through a triad of love, lover, and beloved, which is a rather common theme within Sufi poetry. Now, love can be seen as the utmost essence of God, being itself. And lover and beloved are the relationship between the human being and God as he is experienced by the human being. Man is the lover who longs for his beloved, which is God, and they gaze upon each other like in a mirror, in mirrors. So in a sense, God sees his own reflection in the mirror of the human being, and the human being sees his own reflection in the mirror of God. And these lovers, want desperately to be close to each other. They want to unite with each other. And so the human being cleans this mirror of his heart so that it more and more can reflect more perfectly God's own reflection. And when this process is finally finished and reaches its culmination, the two are finally united and they reflect each other perfectly. And in this meeting, they realize that the difference between lover and beloved was only really an illusion, and the only thing that ever existed was the reality of love itself, which is identical with God's essence, Avat, or being itself as such. Then the eye of certainty opens, and staring inwardly at himself, he finds himself lost, vanished. But he finds the friend, and when he looks still deeper, realizes the friend is himself. He exclaims, "Beloved, I sought you here and there, asked for news of you from all I met. Then I saw you through myself, and found we were identical. Now I blush to think I ever searched for signs of you." The goal of these Sufi practices, or the goal of life in general, is to fight against your nafs, your ego, or your lower self, and finally reach unity, or to unite with God. But to Ibn Arabi and many other Sufis, there is never any uniting with God. This would actually be an impossibility, since that would mean that there was an imperfection in God if something can be added to him. Non-existence can never unite with absolute being. This is just an impossibility. Instead, Ibn Arabi puts a lot of emphasis on self-knowledge, since the human being and the self is a direct reflection of God as everything else is. The key to, so to say, enlightenment is actually to know yourself, to gain knowledge of your own self. There's a hadith where the Prophet Muhammad is thought to have said, "Know yourself and you shall know your Lord." Thus, the goal is to realize that one's own separate existence is a kind of illusion, as we are only the continuous self-manifestations of God. Thus, to know ourselves and to know our soul in a proper way is to know God. So there is no uniting with God. The part of us that is creature, the part of us that is separate from Him, can never unite with Him. The goal is to realize that there is nothing but God and that our being is His being. Put in another way, uniting with God is not a process. It's a realization of what has always been. We don't unite with God, we realize that we, in a sense, were God all along. That about summarizes it. It should be pointed out that there have been diverging opinions and understandings within Sufism regarding details and certain aspects of this idea or this philosophy, but it has been incredibly influential and important in the history of Sufism and has had effects or influence on many regions of the Muslim world. Ibn Arabi's school and the unity of being has had a particularly strong spread in the Persian and Indian regions, and as you can imagine, its meeting with certain Vedanta schools of Hinduism garnered some incredibly interesting results, which I can and probably will dedicate several videos to in the future, but that's for another day. In any case, the unity of being has also been a very divisive philosophy. While it was rather popular in certain Sufi circles, others have rejected it completely. Scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn Khaldun and many more have seen it as dangerous and even heretical. And there has always been a debate, even though it has been very popular in certain times and places, there's always been a debate about its orthodoxy, so to speak. I will be doing more videos about these subjects and about individuals from Ibn Arabi's school. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about, so be sure that I will be doing more material